Good afternoon, everyone. We're slowly welcoming all our attendees in. All right. A warm welcome to you all from wherever you're joining us from around Australia and overseas. 大家好. My name is Zach Eggleston, the Events Manager of the Australia-China Business Council Victoria. I'll begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and from all the localities around Australia where our audience may be today, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'm delighted today to welcome Jim Lang, Managing Director of TradeData International, to deliver a tailor-made report for the ACBC community. The principal objective of TradeData International is to access the most detailed trade information possible from around the world and to analyze this information to enable clients to make better business decisions. Jim is a senior economist with more than 40 years experience in applied economic and statistical research and regularly informs services to governments, firms, governments, industry and economic development agencies. He is an unrivaled expert in international trade statistics, able to distill large amounts of data into understandable trends to paint a true picture of Australia's trade with China. I'd also like to introduce today our fantastic moderator, Mr. Barry White, Vice President of ACBC Victoria, with experience in China dating back to 1978, where he played a major role in developing the Australian Wool Corporation's China projects. Barry has led major ministerial trade missions, advises Chinese and Australian parties through his private consulting firm ProX Development, and was an instrumental part of Australia's early economic engagement with China. Thank you for leading this event today, Barry. To make today's session interactive, we encourage attendees to join the conversation by posting any questions you have about the numbers, trends, or broader economic questions for our expert speaker in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. You can also use the chat function. Both will be acceptable today. A reminder that today's event is being recorded and a copy of Jim's presentation will be made available to all attendees after the event. I will now hand over to ACBC Vice President Barry White. Thanks to you both for your time today.
Thanks very much, Zach, for that introduction, and welcome to everyone to this event today. We felt that this was extremely important. There's been a lot of media coverage on the bilateral relationship with China. There's certainly been a lot of political noise, which is impacting on the trade. But I think it was time that we actually had a comprehensive and objective review of just what the trade relationship is at the present time, and particularly the figures behind our bilateral trade, so that people really understand what the position is. As I said, there's certainly been negative media, particularly arising from the earlier trade intervention and sanctions against exports from Australia of barley, meat, seafood, wine and timber. And of course, compounding those problems has been the impact of COVID, particularly on the services sector, international students and tourism in particular. But today, Jim Lang, who, as Zach mentioned, is Managing Director of TradeData, has been analysing this data for many, many years. What you'll see today is certainly very comprehensive, but it's only the tip of the iceberg in many respects of the data that is available. So we're looking forward to looking at the data. There's a lot of information, and as Zach said, the information will be available to participants today after the event to allow you a bit more time to analyse what is being presented. And there will be the opportunity for questions to be raised at the end of the presentation. And if we don't have enough time to deal with all of the questions, we will provide Jim's details, or we'll pass on those questions directly to him. So with that introduction, I'd like to introduce Jim Lang, and Jim will go through his presentation. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Barry. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you're located. Today, I'll be looking at Australia to China trade using Australian export statistics and using Chinese import statistics. wherever you see a year in a chart or a table, it's always the year ending June. Got next slide, thanks, Zach. I'm starting off with basically an overview of Australian exports to China. My phone just rang, so I'll just turn that off. Australian exports is dominated by trade in iron ore and in coal. And you can see there on the chart, the blue and the grey. We don't deal with services exports, that is TradeData International. We only deal with merchandise trade. The Australia-China Business Council has given me some estimates of services exports in terms of tourism and education, and they're extremely significant, as you can see on the chart on the right. But the focus of today is more on Victorian exports. Next slide, please. Victorian exports to China are very different to Australia. They're really much concentrated in horticultural and agricultural products. We can see that in the year ending June 2021, Victorian exports to China declined by about $1.4 billion. Next slide, please. Today, the outline of the presentation, I'll have a quick look at iron ore and coal, but I won't focus on that, as it's well covered in the press. I've got a note here on my screen saying for me to start my video. I'm not sure what that is. The major focus today will be on the larger Victorian items where exports to China have declined, followed by non-Victorian items where exports have fallen, and then followed by Victorian items that have held, where exports have held up. The major items where exports have declined are on the table there. We're talking wood chips, wine, citrus, meat, barley, and so on. Again, a reminder that any years in the table, it's always the year ending June. Next slide, please. Let's have a quick look at iron ore and coal. Iron ore exports have been maintained. We can see that in the top left chart with the blue chart, the blue bars. Coal exports have fallen rapidly. Nearly all of iron ore comes out of Western Australia. The bottom left chart really shows the iron ore story, and as far as the average price of iron ore has tripled over the last 3 years. The coal chart, coal exports are basically, we're talking Queensland and New South Wales. Next chart, please. For iron ore, Australia has maintained its share of the Chinese market. We can see that from the blue line. The orange line shows that in early this year, China basically stopped buying coal from Australia. Our market share went down to 0. The bottom left-hand chart shows that as China decreased its imports from Australia, Australia has been able to replace those imports by exports to Japan, India, and South Korea. The chart on the right shows that total coal exports have held up. They've declined a little bit, but nothing like the volumes you would have expected with the decline in Chinese imports from Australia. Next slide, please. Where is China purchasing its coal from? You can see there the blue columns were coal from Australia that's collapsed. They're now being supplied by coal from Indonesia and Russia. Next slide, please. So I've turned now to China's Australian exports to China of wood and articles of wood. From an export perspective, we're basically talking wood chips and rough sawn wood. If you look at the top left chart, you can see that the exports to Australia have collapsed. However, this chart is actually misleading. In October last year, exports of wood chips to China, to Japan, and to Taiwan were made confidential in the Australian export statistics. Exports rough sawn wood, we can see on the bottom right chart. Again, the exports of rough sawn wood have fallen to China. Next chart, please. Because of the confidentiality in the Australian data, China import data is actually a better measure of Australia's performance in the Chinese market. China's imports of rough sawn wood and wood chips have risen, but imports from Australia for both products have declined. Next slide, please. The top chart shows rough sawn wood exports. Australia and Victoria's market share in China for rough sawn timber. And you can see early this year, our market share went from 6 to 10% down to 0. So China stopped importing that sort of timber from Australia. Since then, Australia has been able to started to export to other countries. We can see in the bottom right-hand corner, there's some exports been picking up there into India and to South Korea, but not to the extent of the previous exports to China. So we're starting to diversify into other markets. Next slide, please. When we're looking at wood chips, the picture is a bit more complicated because of the confidentiality in the Australian data. Australia's market share in wood chips has fallen down to around 20% after being up around 40%. From the Australian export data, the data is confidential now, as are our exports to Japan and Taiwan. We can see those confidential exports in that grey line on the bottom chart. And as there's been a strong increase in confidential exports, now confidential exports are the sum of China, Japan, and Taiwan. And as imports from Australia, from the China import data has been declining, then exports to Taiwan and Japan must have increased strongly to take up that drop in exports to China. So basically the wood chip market is one where we've diversified into Japan and Taiwan and away from China. Next slide, please. We're looking at China imports of wood in the rough. We were a significant supplier and they stopped importing from Australia in February this year. The Australian supply to China was replaced in China by increased supply from New Zealand, Germany, and the USA. If we're looking at China imports of wood chips, Australia's supply was replaced by increased exports from Vietnam. Next slide, please. We're looking now at Australian exports of wine. And Australian exports are concentrated into bottled wine. And as we all know, wine exports have been a big topic in the press. Our exports to China have declined sharply over the last 2 years. One interesting factor of the China export market, if you look at the bottom left chart, the blue line is the average price to China of wine in bottles less than 2 litres. The grey line is the average price to all other markets, but not China. And we can see that basically China's paying double or sometimes triple the price of all other countries where we export our wine to. So China is a high price market, and this price is increasing over time. Our exports are concentrated mostly from South Australia and to a lesser extent, Victoria. Next slide, please. We can see here from the top left chart that basically wine exports ceased in early 2021 in smaller containers, and there's a tiny bit of exports in large containers. The bottom right chart tells us that our exports are mostly red wine exports rather than fortified or white wine exports. Next slide, please. Has Australia found new markets? The red bar is where our exports to China. When you look at the last 6 months, no other country has really grown significantly enough to replace the exports that we were formerly sending to China. So has Australia found new markets? I would say not yet. Next slide. Where is China purchasing its wine from? Well, two things are happening here. One, that they're increased their exports from Chile, Spain, and France. But two, they're buying less wine than they were previously. So maybe the higher tariffs is an advantage to domestic producers. So maybe the imports of wine are falling due to the higher tariffs, and the consumption has moved across more to domestic producers. Next slide, please. We're looking now at Australian exports of fruit and nuts. These are mostly citrus, grapes, nuts, and to a lesser extent, stone fruits. The exports declined in 2021 due to falls in exports to citrus and grapes. And Victoria, in this case, is the major export state, followed by New South Wales and Queensland. Next slide, please. Victorian exports decline in 2021 is due to declines in grapes and citrus. Exports of nuts and stone fruits are maintained. So it's a grapes and citrus story. Next slide, please. China's imports of fruits and nuts, we can see, has stabilized over the last 3 years. There's been increased imports of stone fruits and nuts and declining imports of citrus and grape. Australia is the 4th largest supplier, but has lost market share in the 2021. Next slide, please. The top left chart is showing you Australia and Victoria's market share for citrus. We can see that's declining over the last couple of years. The chart next to it on the right-hand side is where Australia is selling its citrus, and there's no evidence yet that another market has taken up the decline in exports to China. The two bottom charts are showing stone fruits, and here we've basically maintained our share of the market. Next slide, please. The top chart are for nuts, and again, we're having a smaller market share over time, and there's a very early indication that we might be diversifying some of that trade into India, but that's only in the last month's data, so it's still a bit early to tell. The bottom two charts are grapes, and we can see there Australia has maintained its share of the Chinese market for grapes. Next slide, please. So where is China purchasing its citrus and its nuts? The reduced supply from Australia has benefited South Africa, that have the same seasonal pattern as we do in Australia. For nuts, the benefit has gone to the USA, Iran, and South Africa. Next slide, please. If we're looking at now Australian exports of meat, meat exports are concentrated in frozen bovine, that's beef, and fresh chilled and frozen sheep and goat meat. Frozen bovine declined sharply in 2021, and Victoria is the third largest exporter behind New South Wales and Queensland. Next slide, please. China's imports of frozen bovine, and to a lesser extent sheep and goat meat, are growing very strongly. But imports from Australia and Australia's market share, Victoria's market share, is declining. If we go back one slide, sorry, that's it. Imports from Australia, is declining, and the been replaced by increased supply from Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. Thank you. Next slide. Where is Australia? Well, we haven't yet found new markets to replace what was previously a higher exports going into China. Next slide. We're looking at live animal exports to China. We're basically talking live bovine animals. And these live animals, Victoria dominates this trade, and there's been a decline in this trade in 2020-21, yet average prices have been maintained or increasing. Next slide. Looking at China imports of live bovine animals, been rapidly growing. Victoria and Australia's market share has fallen substantially. If you go back 2 or 3 years, we had sort of 80 to 100% of the market. We've now got 30 to 40% of the market. This market share has been taken by New Zealand, whose share has increased by 250%, and by Uruguay and Chile. Next slide, please. Has Australia been able to replace those exports to China? Not yet. The live bovine trade is beef cattle and dairy cattle. Dairy cattle exports are still increasing. So it's been the beef cattle where the fall off in our exports has been. And there's been no real apparent substitution into other markets. If you look at the chart in the middle, that's purebred beef cattle, there's a little bit of an increase in exports into Indonesia and Vietnam as our exports to China have fallen off, but not a major increase yet. Next slide, please. This is showing China imports of live bovine animals, and you can see the decreased supply from Australia is being offset by supply from New Zealand and Uruguay. Next slide, please. We're looking now at exports of raw hides and skins to China. We're talking mainly bovine, sheep and lamb hides. Our exports have declined over 6 years to be less than half of what they were back in 2016. Next slide, please. China imports by country of bovine and can be seen there. China imports declined sharply in 2021, and Australia and Victoria's market share has declined over the last 2 years as well. When we're looking at Australian exports, we can see China was a dominant market on the bottom left-hand chart, the blue columns. And as those exports have declined, there hasn't been any major substitution into other markets. This is for bovine hides and skins. Next slide, please. If we're looking at sheep hides and skins, there's been a decline in China's imports, but in this case, Australia and Victoria have maintained their share of the market. So the decline in the market share has been in bovine and not in sheep and lamb. Next slide, please. Turn our attention to cereals. China exports to cereals. Barley dominated our exports going back a few years, and barley exports have all but ceased. The exports are mostly coming out of Western Australia. Exports of smaller items, wheat and grain sorghum, have been maintained, as have average prices. Next slide. China imports of barley have doubled in the last year, whereas imports from Australia have all but ceased. If you notice, back in 2018, Australia supplied about 70% of the China import market. 2021, a tiny percent of the market. Where has China importing its barley? It's now coming from Canada, France, Ukraine, and Argentina. Next slide, please. Has Australia found new markets for its barley? The answer is yes. Exports have collapsed to China and now replaced by exports to Saudi Arabia, Thailand, Japan, Vietnam, and elsewhere. Next slide, please. We're looking at major Victorian items now where there hasn't been a decline in trade. And this one is wool. Wool not carded or combed. Australian exports are concentrated in that product. Victoria accounts for about half of our exports. Average prices declined a little bit over the last 2 years, and the export volume has increased in 2021. Next slide, please. These slides basically tell us that China's imports are also in wool, not carded or combed, and that Australia accounts for about 65 to 80% of the market, and these market shares have been stable over time. Next slide. Looking at Australian exports of dairy products. Dairy is basically milk in powder or liquid forms. Victoria accounts for about 75% of the market of Australian exports, and these exports are increasing strongly. Next slide, please. China imports of dairy products. We can see in 2021, there's only a tiny growth in that market. I'm just speculating, maybe that's a COVID impact after many years of strong growth. Australia accounts for between 10 and 20% of the market, and Victoria about 75% of Australia's exports. There doesn't appear to be any sort of trade dispute impact on Australia's exports to China. Next slide, please. Australia-China trade in pharmaceuticals. Australia's exports are concentrated in medicines, and these have grown very strongly. These are coming out of New South Wales and Victoria. Australia is only a small supplier. It's not in the top 10 suppliers to China, but it's rapidly growing, and as are China's imports. The major suppliers to China are Hong Kong, European countries, and the USA. Next slide, please. Confidential items. One aspect of the Australian statistics are where there's very few exporters, an exporter can go to the Bureau of Statistics and ask that the exports are held confidential on the basis that if there's only one or two exporters exporting to China, if they publish the total figures, the second exporter will then know what the first exporter is exporting because they can just subtract their trade from the total. And due to strictly enforced privacy laws in Australia, the exporter can go to the Bureau of Statistics, claim a confidential restriction. The Bureau of Statistics will have a look at the data, and if it's true that it's fairly easy to work out the individual or the company involved in that trade, they will make it confidential. These confidentiality restrictions are looked at every few months, but the current confidentiality restrictions to China are listed in that table up on the top right-hand corner: rice, canola, uranium, magnesium, so on. What happens in this case is all these exports to China are put into a country called no country details. And the chart there lists the no country details. You notice there's some negative figures. The reason for that is that the states and the port details are also confidentialized. So if they're added in twice. So they need to be some negative figures to reduce, to take out the double counting due to the confidentiality. In total, our confidential exports to China are declining. Looking at that list above, I'm assuming that the major confidential items for Victoria would be rice, canola, beer, hides, and wood chips. And these exports have declined in recent years. Next slide. So what does all these charts and all these numbers mean? Firstly, I'm focusing on merchandise trade. I've put in a red line there, which is the average exports between 2017 and 2019. And then I'll put a blue trend line between 2019 and 2021. The difference in those two trends would equate to just under 500 million Australian dollars a year, a decline of just under $500 million. When I look at that chart, I really, in retrospect, should have put the second line just covering the last year, not the last 2 years, because many of the reductions in trade started in early 2021. If I had done that, I think the decline in Victorian exports due to the cessation of trade of many of those products would probably be closer to about $800 million a year. This is certainly important. If you're the consolidator and the fruit packer at Mildura who's packaging up the citrus fruit that was selling it to China at high prices, and China overnight stops buying your fruit, it's certainly very significant for your enterprise. But when you compare that total, let's say 500 to 800 million, with the decline in service exports. Now, service exports is not something that we analyze as a company, but I've just made an assumption there that 30% of education and tourism services generated from Victoria. This amounts to about $7 billion a year, rather than 700 or 800 million compared with the merchandise trade. So my overall conclusion is certainly the merchandise trade are significant for the sectors concerned, but really they're dwarfed by the services trade. Thank you, Zach. I'm happy to take questions.
Okay, I'll if I could, Jim, I'd just lead off with a question. Just with respect to the items that you've analysed compared to the significance of iron ore and coal in the aggregate figures. I think you did have a slide there. Are you able to go back and have a look at that, just so that we get an idea of just how significant those particular items are?
That's the second slide, Zach. So basically my presentation is looking at the top 10% of that bar in 2021. The blue in that bar is iron ore. The pink is the confidential items, and the grey in the previous year is coal. So we're talking basically 15, maybe, yeah, around 15% of total value of exports to China. This is what my presentation focuses on, whereas the iron ore is 70 to 80% and the coal 10 to 15%.
I guess, I mean, what that highlights to me is just how important iron ore is in the overall context of what we're discussing today. I mean, it's such a dominant item, and it also highlights potentially the risk associated with that particular product.
Correct, very much so. Today's focus was more on Victoria. And of course, the iron ore is not a Victorian export item, but you're right, in relative terms, what I talked about today is very small relative just to iron ore.
There's a question here from Robert Wang. Has coal export been recently increased due to, let me pick that up again, due to severe shortage of coal in China?
It hasn't come through in the numbers yet, but I saw in the press just a few days ago that they're starting to release some of the stockpile of the Australian product. So I would suspect next month's import data would start to show that.
Because again, that I mean, the impact, dramatic increase, the decrease rather in coal is highly significant, and particularly in the context of what's being discussed at the moment with respect to fossil fuels.
And the other aspect, Barry, that chart there is in dollars, it's not in volume. Remember, the iron ore price has grown very rapidly.
Right.
In volume, if we go to, I think, if we go a couple slides down, there's the volume, the next slide, and next one again. We can see here, up one slide, that's it. The iron ore volumes is the blue bar there. They've been maintained. But the bottom chart, bottom left, is the iron ore price, which has gone through the roof.
Okay, there's another question, Jim, from Wengu. Do you foresee any potential risk for Australia or Victoria's dairy sector to China? And if you do, what would it be?
Well, there's nothing in the data would suggest that. The exports are increasing, the prices are increasing. There's nothing in the data that suggests that. But that doesn't mean, you know, that for political or any other reason might come into play. But there's nothing in the data that suggests there's any risk at the moment.
Right. Okay, well, I think an associated concern when you look at the figures is the impact that the trade sanctions from China have had, that's the increased tariffs, have had on exports of those particular products that I mentioned at the start. Clearly barley and wine. Seafood wasn't mentioned because it's not one of the top 10, but seafood, meat was. So it's, I mean, the impact has been significant, to say the least.
Yep.
Right, do we have any other questions? Just with respect to Victoria, I guess another question from me. It's interesting to look at what's happening with the wool industry and wool exports from Victoria, because there doesn't seem to be a lot of focus on the significance of the export value of wool from Victoria, but it's held up very well, and it's such, wool is such a high proportion of Chinese imports. I just wonder if we could just have another quick look at that slide as well. There we go. And I just wanted to pick up where Victoria sat in.
Okay, if we go down, where are we? The top right chart there, the state of origin. That's Australian export to China of wool. So Victoria in the last year has increased its exports. It looks like it's accounting for 65% of the total.
Right. I guess an associated question, I mean, relates more to import prices into China. Are they based on CIF figures, or are they?
Imports by international convention are recorded on a CIF basis, and exports on an FOB basis. So the import price is, yes, on a CIF basis.
Yeah, I mentioned that in the context of the current increase in transport costs, particularly freight. And I guess I would have expected more of a negative reaction to some of these products because of freight. But I mean, some of the one I'm just referring to doesn't seem to have had an impact again on the wool exports, which I would have expected. There's another question. Again from Robert Wang. How much export value was lost to China in general since the relationship worsened from last year? That's just merchandise alone. I think you mentioned that.
Well, I did a rough estimate for Victoria, and I would say it's going to be $700 or $800 million on merchandise. Although if you go to the second or third slide, it gives you total Victoria and Australian exports to China. Where are we? Go up one more slide, I think, Zach. Okay, there's Victorian exports to China have declined by about 1.3 billion. And if you go up again, Zach, well, Australian exports are dwarfed by the price of iron ore.
Right.
So in terms of Victoria, I've estimated that let's take a figure around 800 million, but 1.3 was the total, which some of that's going to be just normal market variation rather than a decision to stop buying from Australia. So I was trying to make a guess that sort of between the two.
Mm-hmm. And again, I don't want to be hogging the questions. Leave this for others, but I'm just interested again to look at the last slide where you talk about services, tourism, and particularly international students. You can go to, I mean, we're looking there at the 2018 financial year or 2019 financial year. I would imagine, and this is only on the basis of anecdotal information, that, and well, we're talking China here, that is virtually zero at the present time.
Correct, correct. And that doesn't include other business services, architectural or health, or that's not included in those service estimates.
Right, right.
And well, I've just made I put my finger in the wind assumption that 30% of that comes from Victoria. But the numbers there are huge by comparison to merchandise trade.
Sure.
That was the point I was trying to make.
Any more questions? Look, I know, just to make a comment, I know it's extremely difficult. We've gone through these slides, these charts very quickly. There's a lot of information contained within them. And again, we would suggest to people that, you know, because there's a recording of this, take your time and have a look at the charts and then come back to Jim later on if you've got any specific questions related to the particular product sector that you're interested in. As I say, it's very, very difficult to comprehend all of this. It looks like a cardiologist's filing cabinet with the number of the charts. Looks like a heart rate analysis, but it's very detailed information. I think it's very significant information because it's telling us how we're doing relative to the rest of the world as suppliers to China, and also, you know, basically the trend in our trade, which is just so important. China is still our #1 trading partner. Yeah, again,
I'm happy for people if they want to send me an email to answer any questions that might come up in the next few days. I would certainly respond to their email.
All right. Look, I think, Jim, on the basis that there are no other questions waiting at the moment that have come through, so I only encourage people to have a look at the particular area, the product sector that's of interest to yourself, or particular concern to yourself, and then feel free to raise questions. You can either do it through ACBC or directly to Jim, or have a look at the presentation again so that you study the detail and hopefully, you know, provide the sort of answers that you might be looking for. I'll just check to make sure there are no other questions. Yeah, I think we've covered the main ones at this stage. But rather than you know, drag out the discussion, I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank you, Jim, for putting that information together. There's a lot of work in analysing that data. Just bear in mind that we've only looked, if you like, at the tip of the iceberg. We've only looked at some of the, if you like, top 10 product sectors. The amount of information that's available to be analysed, you know, down to other codes within the customs information is significant, to say the least. I mean, there's just so much information to get your head around. But I'd suggest that, again, if you have any particular issues about your particular product, feel free to talk to Jim, make contact. I'm sure he'll be happy to provide additional detail. So with that, Jim, thanks very much for putting this presentation together. It's very, very detailed, and we appreciate having that information. I think it's information that doesn't exist in the public domain at the present time. Unfortunately, as I say, a lot of people's trade knowledge is provided by what's in the media, and a lot of that's, you know, the result of, I guess, more political commentary than that it is based on actual data. So it's important to get the objective data so that people can see what really is going on. And it's important from a strategic point of view, I would suggest, for companies to understand that information as part of their planning for entry into the China market or retention of the China market. So with that, I would just like to thank everybody for coming along today, for participating in the presentation, to Jim, as I say, and look forward to further contact. So, Zach, I'll hand back to you if there are any final comments.
Thanks so much, Barry, and thanks, Jim, for that fantastic presentation. Just so everyone in the audience knows, we'll be sharing a recording of this event along with Jim's presentation. With our thanks to Jim for preparing that. It was really insightful, and I think it's a really good resource for ACBC to have, and we'll put it up in our Insight Centre, which all our members can access as well. So in the follow-up email, we'll include all that information along with upcoming ACBC Victoria events. We have quite a busy calendar leading into the end of the year, including a big hydrogen event planned for November. So keep an eye on your inbox for that. And I guess, I'll close the session there. Thanks so much, Jim, and thanks, Barry, and thanks everyone on the line today.
Bye-bye.